The area around the bridge is secure.
Good. What about the north flank?
We have patrols in position.
The morning air was heavy with cordite and damp fog rolling in from the fields. From the cracked windows of a commandeered farmhouse, German technical officers hunched over a desk littered with binoculars, range charts, and a single crumpled report. The numbers on the page should have been impossible. 82% destroyed. Their hands trembled as they passed the sheet to one another, whispering calculations that violated every law of probability drilled into them at
Let's
Luftwaffe
make sure everything
schools.
is in order.
Through their field telescopes, they had seen it themselves. V-1 flying bombs. Hitler's vengeance weapon designed to terrify London into submission were being ripped from the sky, not by daring fighter pilots or tangled in barrage balloon cables, but by artillery fire. Shell bursts, detonating not on direct hits, but impossibly close, as if the shells somehow knew where the target would be. Each detonation carved smoking arcs across the morning horizon, leaving German officers staring in disbelief at the contrails collapsing into the channel. At Chateau d'Oberst Max Vettel, commander of Flak Regiment 155 Watts, read the same reports with a tightening jaw. Just weeks earlier, the gun belt along the French coast had claimed only a fraction of the V-1s. Now, day after day, the interception rate had climbed beyond reason. 17% in June, 74% by late August, and now on this extraordinary morning, more than 80% of Hitler's miracle weapons were dying in 10. Mid-air, before they ever reached England. What the Germans could not grasp was that they were staring at the dawn of a weapon so secret it was guarded at the same level as the atomic bomb. A weapon that would change the balance of the war and shatter their faith in the very science they trusted. The reports piling up on Oberst Max Vettel's desk were more than statistics. They were an assault on German certainty. For months, Berlin had assured him that the weapon he commanded, the V-1 flying bomb, was unstoppable, a machine so perfectly conceived that no British defense could hope to keep pace. And why wouldn't he believe it? The weapon was the embodiment of German engineering, simple, brutal, effective. It carried no pilot to risk, no formation to protect, no complex mission planning to untangle. It was a missile before the world even had a name for such a thing. Cheap to build, terrifying to behold, and designed to slip past the very limits of Allied defenses. The V-1 was meant to be the iron hammer blow against London, a city already stretched to exhaustion by years of war. The V-1 was nothing less than Hitler's promise made steel. At its core, it was a pilotless aircraft with stubby wings and a warhead of 850 kilograms of amytal packed into its blunt nose. Its propulsion came from the Argus S-014 pulse jet engine, a growling, coughing contraption that inhaled fuel in violent bursts, producing a sound that Londoners would later call the buzz bomb. Its speed was steady, 640 kilometers per hour, faster than most Allied fighters could sustain in a climb, and it flew at altitudes designed to frustrate interception anywhere between 600 and 2700 meters. At that heightened speed, the Germans calculated British gunners would be mathematically blind, their shells bursting harmlessly in empty sky, while the bombs thundered overhead toward the city. Dr. Robert Lusser, the man behind the V-1's control system, had spoken with almost religious conviction about its design. He insisted that the bomb was too fast, too small, and too resilient to stop in numbers that mattered. The Luftwaffe's technical schools reinforced this belief with numbers of their own. Ballistic probability was on Germany's side. For anti-aircraft guns to strike a target as small and as swift as the V-1, they would need to land a direct hit, a 1 in 10,000 chance under the best of circumstances. Even with coordinated fire, gunners would waste thousands of shells for every lucky strike. Lusser's projections, which circulated through the corridors of Peenemünde and the Reich Air Ministry, declared that Allied interception rates would hover below 5%. Even the most optimistic predictions from London could not hope for more than 10. That promise was intoxicating. For Hitler, it was salvation. The Reich had bled itself dry in Russia, and the Allied landings in Normandy threatened collapse from the west. What Germany needed was terror, a way to bring the war home to Britain once again. The Führer had never forgotten the Blitz of 1940 when the Luftwaffe's bombs had set London ablaze. The V-1 was his chance to relive that nightmare, only this time with a weapon that carried no risk of German pilots being shot down or captured. It was vengeance given wings. At Peenemünde, Major Walter Dornberger and his staff calculated the arithmetic of destruction. With launch ramps lined along the French coast firing salvos into the pre-dawn skies, even a 25% success rate would equal the tonnage of the Blitz. London would burn and the British spirit would break. Each V-1 cost barely 5,000 Reichsmarks to produce a fraction of the price of a Heinkel bomber, and it required no rare metals or advanced components. Slave labor in underground factories would churn them out by the thousands. To German planners, the math was undeniable. The V-1 was a weapon of efficiency as much as terror. And so, in the dark hours of June 13th, 1944, 1 week after Allied boots dug into the sand at Normandy, the first V-1 screamed across the Channel. Londoners woke not to sirens but to an alien noise, a buzzing like an enraged hornet amplified by steel. Then silence, the engine cut out, and a heartbeat later Grove Road and Bow vanished in fire and dust. 6 people died instantly, 30 more lay wounded, and 200 were made homeless. A railway bridge crumpled into ruin. It was only the first. Dozens more followed that day. The British had braced themselves for counterattacks after D-Day, but not this. Not a pilotless missile falling from the sky, with no warning, no way to predict where it would land. The German press, carefully orchestrated, hailed the launch as a triumph of vengeance. England Trembles one headline blared before the weapon of reprisal. Across the Channel, German officers drank to the numbers 850 kilograms of high explosive for every missile one after another until London was a ruin of ash and rubble. To Vettel and his regiment, the V-1 campaign was more than duty, it was inevitability. The calculations had been proven. The missile was fast enough to outrun interception, cheap enough to overwhelm defenses, and reliable enough to deliver death without question. In German mess halls and briefing rooms, officers spoke of the V-1 with reverence. It was not the exotic, expensive folly of the V-2 rocket. It was not the fragile experiment of jet fighters that still sputtered on short airfields. The V-1 was practical, scalable, and already killing. Gunners along the French coast watched their missiles streak toward the horizon with pride. Every contrail etched across the sky was a promise that Britain's days were numbered. To reinforce that belief, the Reich armed itself with science. At the Luftwaffe's Flakschule, instructors drew diagrams on chalkboards showing the mathematics of interception. Time-fused shells required prediction. The gunner had to guess the speed, altitude, and bearing of a target, then twist dials to set the fuse and fire at exactly the right moment. Against lumbering bombers, this was difficult. Against a darting V-1, it was impossible. Even if every calculation were perfect, the fuse might burst hundreds of meters from the missile. To bring down a V-1, a gunner needed luck bordering on divine providence. Probability was the German comfort. They believed numbers as surely as they believed steel. And those numbers told them that the V-1 was nearly untouchable. Their confidence grew with each launch ramp completed, each convoy of pulse-jet engines delivered to the assembly lines hidden deep underground. At Peenemünde, scientists toasted with schnapps, proclaiming that British skies would soon darken with fire. At the Wolfslayer, Hitler himself clutched a model of the missile, his eyes glittering as he spoke of retribution. They will not endure this, he told his staff. They cannot. And yet, even as Oberst Vettel read the impossible numbers weeks later, 74% destroyed, 82% on one day, he remembered those boasts. He remembered the certainty of Lüsser's equations, the diagrams on chalkboards, the arrogance of Dornberger's projections. He remembered the roar of the first V-1's tearing across the Channel. All of it had been built on the unshakable belief that the missile could not be stopped. But belief is not proof. Science, so carefully harnessed in Germany's laboratories, was about to betray them. They had calculated the mathematics of interception. What they had not calculated was the possibility of a weapon that defied their mathematics entirely. For Vettel and the men of Flak Regiment 155 Watts, the V-1 had been more than a missile, it had been certainty itself. Now that certainty was cracking, and with it the very foundation of German faith in their wonder weapons. The first weeks of the V-1 campaign seemed to prove every German calculation correct. In June 1944, the buzz bombs roared across the Channel with their guttural drone, each one a mechanical predator aimed at London. The British capital staggered under the initial blows. Buildings were torn open, like paper bridges collapsed, and families who had survived the Blitz now fled into shelters once again. The weapon was working. The numbers fit the promise. In Peenemunde's polished briefing rooms, charts confirmed what the Reich had hoped. Of the thousands launched in the first salvos, only a fraction were intercepted. Less than 20% fell short of their targets, most due to mechanical failure or navigational error. The rest crashed into Britain with thunderous consequence. German officers pointed to the statistics with grim satisfaction. The V-1 was exacting its toll. Hitler demanded more ramps, more missiles, more terror. For a moment, the dream seemed alive. London shook, and German radio trumpeted vengeance. The Reich had conjured a weapon that required no ace pilots, no daring missions, only the simple repetition of firing one machine after another. It was mathematics and inevitability. But beneath the headlines and speeches, faint whispers of unease began to ripple through the German command. Reports filtered back from French observation posts and naval lookouts along the coast. Strange patterns emerged in their logs. A missile that had passed smoothly into British airspace suddenly detonated in midair. Another burst apart when flak shells erupted nearby, not striking it directly, but close enough to shear its wings and send it tumbling like a broken toy. Crews watching through binoculars saw the impossible artillery shells finding their mark with uncanny precision. At first, the officers dismissed it as chance. Even 1 in 10,000 shots, after all, could succeed with luck. A British gunner firing blindly might get lucky once, maybe twice, but then the percentages began to shift. In late June, interception rates climbed to 24%. Not catastrophic, but troubling. The mathematics said this should not be happening. The British were not supposed to improve at this pace. By July, the unease hardened into disbelief. Reports arriving at Oberst Vettel's headquarters told of batteries along the south coast claiming more and more kills with fewer and fewer shells. One chart, meticulously drafted by German analysts, showed the line of British success curving upward month by month. It was not a gentle slope, but a sharp climb. By mid-July, a full third of the missiles were being destroyed before reaching their targets. German officers argued late into the night. Was sabotage at play? Were the missiles defective? Teams inspected engines, guidance, gyros, and warhead fuses. Nothing was wrong. Test launches over German territory performed exactly as designed. Yet in Britain the same weapon failed again and again, cut from the sky by flak that should never have been able to reach it. The contradiction gnawed at them. Technical officers who had once spoken with certainty now muttered over coffee-stained reports, scratching their heads at data that mocked their equations. A British gunner could not possibly calculate and set a time fuse with such perfection, not against a target flying at 640 kilometers per hour. Even if they guessed correctly, the odds of placing a shell close enough to rupture a missile were infinitesimal, and yet day after day, the statistics defied belief. The most unnerving testimonies came from German spotters watching with their own eyes. Through field glasses they had witnessed V-1s, flying steady engines growling, when suddenly they were enveloped by bursts of flak. No direct impact, no obvious strike, just explosions near the missile, and then, as if guided by fate, the bomb staggered, caught fire, and plummeted. To the Germans on the ground, it was sorcery, masquerading as artillery. By late July, the kill rate had risen again. Nearly half of the V-1s were being stopped. Panic crept into the margins of official reports. One colonel scrawled a note beside the figures. This cannot be accurate. These numbers contradict the principles of ballistics. Another officer warned that if the trend continued, the weapon might lose its terror entirely. London would endure, and the V-1 would be reduced from strategic hammer to wasted steel. In Berlin, the Reich Air Ministry demanded explanations. Vettel was summoned to present the statistics before skeptical superiors who frowned at the charts but offered no answers. He described what his men had seen: shells that detonated not on contact but near the target, as though they could sense the missile. His words were met with uneasy silence. Such technology was fantasy, the province of science fiction, not real battlefields. Still, the numbers refused to be ignored. By August, interception rates exceeded 70%. On some days, the British coastal gunbelt achieved impossible triumphs, annihilating 4 out of every 5 missiles launched. The curve on the German charts now rose like a cliff face, and the confidence that had once buoyed Peenemünde evaporated into dread. Rumors spread through the regiment. Some whispered that the British had perfected radar fire control beyond anything Germany imagined. Others claimed the English had developed shells that exploded faster or with more shrapnel. A few muttered about sabotage, saboteurs tampering with the missiles on assembly lines deep underground. None of it fit. The truth was stranger than any guess, and no one dared to admit it aloud. Perhaps the Allies had created something Germany had declared impossible. At Chateau de Vettel sat in his office, the summer heat pressing against stone walls as reports piled around him like accusations. He reread the figures until his vision blurred, until the numbers danced into mockery. 82% destroyed. 82% in a single day. If this was accurate, then the Reich's vengeance weapon, the promise of inevitability, was crumbling in plain sight. The contradiction became a torment. Every principle taught at German academies, every law of ballistics, every calculation drawn on chalkboards had said the same thing: the V-1 could not be stopped. And yet the British were stopping it. Not once, not twice, but with mechanical regularity, as if they possessed a secret science that bent probability itself. The questions thundered in Vettel's mind as he stared out the farmhouse window toward the west, where smoke trails still hung in the morning sky. How had the British cracked the uncrackable? What weapon were they hiding? Was it possible that Germany, the nation of precision and engineering, had been outpaced by the very enemies they mocked? The unease spread upward. At Peenemünde, Dornberger and his engineers debated heatedly, their voices echoing off concrete walls. Lusser clung to his equations, insisting the data was flawed, exaggerated, or forged. Others demanded new tactics, night launches, altered altitudes, greater salvos. Each change yielded little. The kill rates remained devastating. It was the beginning of a crisis no calculation could resolve. The V-1 had been built on certainty, but certainty itself was collapsing. In the uneasy silence of command rooms across occupied France, German officers realized they were facing something they could neither see nor understand. The laws of probability had betrayed them. A weapon designed to terrify Britain was instead eroding German confidence. And as August burned toward its final week, the impossible became undeniable. London still stood. The skies over the Channel glowed with flak bursts that found their marks again and again. The question that haunted every German commander was no longer whether the V-1 would succeed, but what hidden hand was reaching into the sky to destroy them. The silence inside German command rooms was more than disbelief. It was humiliation. Numbers that should never have existed had become routine. 82%. 4 out of 5 V-1s ripped from the sky before they ever touched British soil. To Oberst Max Vettel and his fellow officers, it was as if the laws of physics themselves had been rewritten. And in truth, they had just not by German hands. What the Germans were staring at but could not name was the emergence of a weapon so secret it was classified on the same level as the Manhattan Project. It was not radar alone. It was not faster fighters or more efficient gunners. It was something altogether different, something that turned the very idea of probability into certainty. It was the proximity fuse. For centuries, artillery had obeyed one brutal truth: a shell only killed what it touched. A gunner could aim at the sky, could calculate trajectories, could spin dials and set fuses, but in the end, it all came down to chance. A shell that missed by 10 meters was useless. A shell that missed by 5 might shower fragments across empty air. To strike a moving target was to ask mathematics to do the work of God. German scientists believed that rule immutable. But in 1944, over the skies of Britain, the rule was broken. The proximity fuse was a revolution disguised as a bullet casing. It transformed every shell from a blind hammer into a thinking predator. Inside the small steel body, where German engineers assumed there was only powder and timing mechanisms, the Allies had hidden a miniature radio transmitter. When the shell was fired, the transmitter pulsed into the void, sending out invisible waves. If nothing reflected back, the fuse remained silent. But when the waves bounced off a solid object, an aircraft, a missile, a V-1, the fuse awakened. Circuits closed, detonators armed, and in the fraction of a second that reflection spiked, the shell exploded. A near miss became a kill. A burst within 10 meters shredded wings. A burst within 20 tore engines apart. Gunners no longer needed the impossible precision of threading a direct strike. The shell itself did the thinking, detonating not when the gunner guessed it should, but when the target was actually there. It was science so far ahead of German assumptions that even if Vettel had captured a dud, he might not have believed what he was holding. German experts had dismissed the concept years earlier. Miniaturized radio circuits, they declared, could never survive the brutal shock of firing. 20,000 times the force of gravity slammed into every component the instant the shell left the barrel. Vacuum tubes would shatter, batteries would rupture, circuits would tear apart. German engineers had tested dozens of designs, all failures. By 1942, they abandoned the dream entirely. Proximity fuses, they told themselves, were impossible. But in American laboratories, impossibility was merely a challenge. At the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, a team led by Dr. Merle Tuve wrestled with the problem. They borrowed from hearing aid designs from consumer radios from the civilian world of electronics. They crafted vacuum tubes so small and so ruggedized they could withstand the punishment of a 90mm gun. They invented batteries that lay dormant for years, yet awoke the instant the shell was fired. They reimagined quality control at a scale no totalitarian system could mimic. Every batch tested, every dud discarded, every circuit refined, until failure was a rarity. By 1944, American factories were producing 4,000 of these fuses every day. By war's end, the total would reach 22 million. The cost had dropped from hundreds of dollars per unit to less than 20. Crosley Corporation, once a maker of refrigerators, now turned out thousands of fuses daily. Women on assembly lines soldered tiny circuits with hands that never knew they were crafting one of the most decisive weapons of the war. The Allies had mobilized an entire industry to hide a radio inside a shell, and in so doing they had rewritten the physics of anti-aircraft defense. The secrecy surrounding the fuse was absolute. Every shell that contained it was accounted for. Gunners were forbidden to let a single dud fall into enemy hands. Naval crews patrolled waters beneath engagement zones, recovering unexploded rounds before they could drift to German shores. Even British soldiers firing the weapons did not know what made their ammunition special. To them, it was simply VT, variable time, an intentionally misleading codename that suggested nothing revolutionary. It was a secret guarded with lives. Proximity-fused artillery was withheld from ground forces in Europe until December 1944, months after its debut against V-1s, because commanders feared a single captured shell might reveal everything. Thousands of Allied soldiers died without that advantage because protecting the secret mattered more. Only against the V-1, with its terror aimed directly at London, was the gamble justified. And so, while Oberst Vettel scoured his reports in France, the truth danced above his head in every flak burst. British batteries had been reorganized, repositioned along the southern coast, armed with American SCR-584 radar to track missiles automatically. Those radars fed coordinates to 90mm guns, and those guns spat out shells armed with proximity fuses. What Vettel saw through his binoculars, missiles shredded by explosions that never struck directly, was the manifestation of a revolution he could not name. The German mind recoiled from it. In Peenemünde, engineers argued bitterly. Some accused British propaganda of inflating kill counts. Others insisted sabotage must be at fault. None accepted the idea of a fuse that detonated itself by sensing its prey. When Allied scientists after the war demonstrated the device to captured German experts, they reacted not with admiration, but with disbelief. They handled the shells as though they were magic, marveling at how tubes survived acceleration, how batteries lasted for years. 10 years ahead, one muttered. They were not wrong. The irony was cruel. In November 1939, the Oslo Report, an anonymous intelligence leak, had hinted at British research into proximity fuses. German intelligence read it, debated it, and dismissed it as disinformation. Their own failures convinced them no one could succeed. That arrogance blinded them. Even when German forces stumbled upon American stockpiles containing proximity-fused shells during the Ardennes offensive, they did not recognize what they had found. They believed it was ordinary ammunition. The miracle lay in their hands, and they let it slip through their fingers. Back in late August 1944, however, none of that mattered to Vettel. What mattered were the numbers in front of him, numbers that shattered faith. 82% interception. Each figure was a dagger into the heart of German certainty. The V-1 had been built on mathematics, and now mathematics itself had betrayed them. The Reich had declared the weapon unstoppable, yet the skies proved otherwise. The proximity fuse was the unseen executioner, the silent partner of radar and gunnery. It required no heroism, no impossible skill. It multiplied the effectiveness of every gun tenfold, transforming ordinary flak batteries into machines of surgical precision. Against the V-1, it was the difference between terror and survival. Against the Luftwaffe, it turned bomber streams into graveyards. And in the Pacific, it shielded fleets from kamikazes, buying time and saving lives that would otherwise have been lost in flames. To the Germans who tried and failed to explain the inexplicable, the secret was unbearable. They had built their vengeance weapon on the promise of inevitability. Yet inevitability itself had been stolen from them by a piece of technology smaller than a man's hand. While Vettel stared out from his observation post, listening to the drone of another V-1 sputter into silence above the channel, he did not know he was watching the dawn of electronic warfare. He only knew that the laws of his world had collapsed and that something impossible had risen in their place. For Oberst Max Vettel and his men, the mystery of the sky remained unsolved. They saw the evidence, the impossible accuracy, the collapsing missiles, the statistics that mocked every German calculation, but they could not name the weapon that was undoing them. What they did not realize was that the secret lay not only in science, but in the vast machinery of industry. The proximity fuse was not merely a scientific miracle, it was an industrial miracle. Germany had always prided itself on craftsmanship. The Reich's propaganda celebrated its weapons as marvels of precision designed by the greatest minds of the fatherland and built in workshops that carried the legacy of centuries of engineering. The V-1 itself was a product of this tradition, assembled in underground factories, its engines fitted by forced laborers, working in suffocating tunnels, carved beneath mountains. Each missile that emerged from metalwork was a thing of sweat, blood, and death. Thousands of prisoners perished in the process, their lives consumed to craft what Hitler called his vengeance. But there was a flaw in this system. Germany's weapons were born in agony, shaped by human suffering rather than mass efficiency. Every V-1 was handmade, every component assembled by fingers trembling from exhaustion and hunger. Even as Peenemunde's engineers bragged of their superiority, production remained painfully limited. By the time the V-1 campaign peaked, Germany had launched just over 9,000 missiles at Britain. The total output of the entire war would not exceed 2,500. It was the scale of a weapon built by a nation trapped in its own system of labor and fear. Across the ocean, the story was different. In the United States, the proximity fuse was not born in secret caves, but in humming factories filled with light and movement. Crosley Corporation in Cincinnati, once known for radios and refrigerators, became a fortress of electronics production. Sylvania Electric devoted its vacuum tube division entirely to the project. Western Electric, the industrial arm of Bell Telephone, retooled its facilities to produce components measured in microns of precision. At peak 8,000 workers, most of them women, filed into these factories every morning. their aprons and overalls covered in solder and grease, their hands assembling the very circuits that would change the war. Each of those workers knew only their part. A woman in Ohio soldered wires onto a tiny tube without knowing it would detonate a shell over the channel. A man in New Jersey tested batteries that would sleep for years inside ammunition crates waiting for the instant of ignition. Compartmentalization was the shield. No one worker understood the whole device. Only a handful of scientists at Johns Hopkins and military officers in Washington grasped the full scope. The secret was buried beneath layers of labor, and silence spread across 110 factories so that no single place could betray it. This was industrial democracy at war. Thousands of citizens, each a cog in a machine so vast that even Hitler's intelligence service could not comprehend it. The result was staggering. By 1945, American factories had produced 22 million proximity fuses. Each one cost less than $20, the price of a pair of boots, and yet each one multiplied the effectiveness of anti-aircraft fire by 10. By comparison, Germany's entire V-1 arsenal was swallowed whole by a single year of Allied fuse production. The contrast was absolute. Germany's miracle weapon required human lives to build. America's miracle fuse required only human hands. In Mittelwerk, prisoners collapsed under beatings and disease while assembling the pulse jets that screamed toward London. In Ipswich, Massachusetts, women in white smocks leaned over microscopes, building ruggedized vacuum tubes with care. One system devoured its people in darkness. The other mobilized them in light, with wages, shifts, and the promise that their unseen work mattered. And the protection of the secret was as ruthless as its production was expansive. Every single proximity-fused shell was tracked from the moment it left a crate to the instant it detonated. British gunners signed for their allotments like clerks in a bank. If a shell failed to explode, recovery teams raced to secure it before the enemy could. Naval vessels patrolled the channel not only to sink submarines but to scoop unexploded ammunition from the sea. Ground forces in Normandy were denied access to the fuse until late 1944, even as they begged for help against German artillery. Soldiers died in hedgerows, while the secret remained locked away too valuable to risk capture. The calculation was cold, but it was necessary. London's survival and the protection of the factories depended on secrecy. The Germans, meanwhile, were blind even when the truth touched them. During the Ardennes offensive, German troops captured American ammunition dumps that contained shells fitted with proximity fuses. They examined them, cataloged them, and dismissed them as ordinary timed ammunition. Their assumptions that such devices were impossible blinded them to the miracle in their hands. Arrogance became ignorance. The secret held. Vettel could not know any of this. As he pored over his reports at Chateau d'Eau, he could not see the 1,000 workers in Cincinnati or the 5,000 women in Ipswich who bent over their benches each night. He could not imagine the warehouses filled with crates stamped VT rolling out of factories by the trainload. To him, the numbers remained a nightmare without explanation. But the explanation was not magic. It was machinery. It was the mobilization of science and industry. The ability of a democracy to harness the talents of its citizens and the resources of its factories in ways that no dictatorship could. For all its vaunted genius, Germany's system strangled itself. It pursued wonder weapons in laboratories and built them in slave pits. It dreamed of rockets and supersonic jets, but it never understood the power of making millions of good weapons rather than a handful of perfect ones. The Allies understood. They did not need a weapon of terror. They needed a weapon of certainty. The proximity fuse was that weapon, and so the imbalance grew. On the same days that Germany scraped to produce a few hundred V-1 Sang, America produced tens of thousands of fuses. While German scientists wrung their hands over unsolvable equations, American workers tightened bolts and soldered wires with the steady rhythm of assembly lines. While slave laborers died in tunnels to build missiles, American women in safe sunlit factories built the devices that would kill those missiles in the sky. That was the true miracle, not just the science, but the scale. The proximity fuse worked because America could build not 1 or 10, but millions. It remained secret because its parts were scattered like stars across a continent invisible to spies and incomprehensible to German intelligence. And it triumphed because it was born not of despair and brutality, but of a society that believed its people could do the impossible together. By the end of August 1944, when Vettel stared at his reports with horror, the truth was already written. The Reich's vengeance weapon was being devoured not by chance, not by sabotage, but by an industrial colossus it could never match. The future of war was not in the hands of single geniuses or secret caves, but in the vast power of mass production. Science and scale, not terror and force, were the new gods of the battlefield. And while German officers searched desperately for answers, the factories of America kept humming every soldered wire another nail in the coffin of Hitler's revenge. By September 1944, the verdict was undeniable. The weapon Hitler had promised as vengeance, the miracle of Peenemünde, the missile that was supposed to terrorize London into submission, had failed. Out of more than 9,500 V-1s launched from the French coast, fewer than 2,600 reached their targets. The rest had been torn from the sky, shredded by flak bursts that German science said could never succeed. The terror campaign collapsed under its own weight, its promise broken not by luck, but by technology. For the Germans, it was a humiliation as much as a defeat. The V-1 had been a weapon of certainty built on equations, calculations, and faith in the unshakable laws of probability. Yet probability had been rewritten by a device no larger than a man's fist. The proximity fuse turned statistics into ruins, transforming every anti-aircraft battery into a weapon of surgical precision. The campaign, meant to cripple British morale instead, became a showcase of Allied ingenuity. The consequences rippled far beyond London. German resources had been drained into a dead end. Slave labor had been consumed in underground tunnels. Thousands of lives lost to build missiles that never reached their targets. Steel fuel and manpower that might have gone to fighters or tanks were wasted on a weapon neutralized before it could alter the war. The Reich had gambled on a wonder weapon, and it had lost to an enemy who did not gamble but built. For the Allies, the lesson was profound. The war was no longer only fought on beaches and battlefields, but in laboratories, on factory floors, in assembly lines that stretched across continents. The victory over the V-1 was not won by soldiers alone, but by scientists who miniaturized circuits, engineers who solved impossible problems, and workers who built millions of devices without ever knowing what they were. The proximity fuse was the quiet triumph of collaboration, the proof that modern war belonged to those who could mobilize both minds and machines. This was the true meaning of industrial democracy. A society that empowered its citizens could create miracles not in secret caves, but in open factories, not through terror, but through collective effort. It could take the ingenuity of a scientist, the precision of an engineer, the labor of a woman at a soldering bench, and fuse them into a weapon that saved a city. Totalitarianism built its weapons with chains. Democracy built its weapons with hands. And when the two clashed, the chains broke. The strategic outcome was clear. London endured. The British people did not break. The V-1 became a symbol not of German power, but of German failure. What had been unveiled with thunder and fire in June was little more than smoke and ashes by September. The skies over the Channel had become a graveyard of vengeance, littered with burning fragments of a weapon Germany believed unstoppable. And with that, the question posed at the dawn of the campaign, the question whispered by German officers staring at their reports, finally had its answer. Could the V-1 change the war? Could a single weapon born of desperation and arrogance bend the fate of nations? The answer was written in the morning skies of late August 1944. No, the V-1 could not alter history because it had been defeated by something Germany never imagined. The marriage of science and industry multiplied 1,000,000 times over. The vengeance weapon had promised terror. The proximity fuse delivered salvation. In the end, the weapon that was supposed to destroy London became the proof that Hitler had already lost. The fall of the V-1 was more than the failure of a weapon. It was the failure of an idea. Germany had trusted terror and craftsmanship, But the Allies had trusted people, science, and the scale of industry. In the skies above London, that difference became destiny. Each proximity-fused shell was not just steel and circuitry. It was proof that democracy's strength lay in its ability to mobilize minds and hands together. The vengeance weapon promised fear, but it was defeated by ingenuity. In that clash, the future of modern war was decided, and the outcome was never in doubt.